This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Chris Blattman, who is a professor in the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and also the author of this book, Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace. So, Chris, I think this is a very ambitious book, right? You're trying to tackle big issue, which is war and conflict and violence. And, um, this is a topic which, for some reason, and I haven't been able to figure this out, has not really been addressed by people with an economics background, right? Economists. I mean, economists tend to focus on environments where the rules of interacting and transacting are very well defined, right? Where contracts can be written, commitments can be exercised, and we also even veer in a direction where information is usually pretty easily accessible, and decision makers are not affected all that much by sort of emotions and other things. Now, I think economists have begun to push the boundaries of all of those stereotypical economics models. But for the most part, conflict, war, and violence has been the domain of political scientists, been the domain of sociologists, maybe the domain of even anthropologists. And so, when we think about economists approaching this issue, to me it seems very natural because I teach strategy, and in strategy, right, it's all about competition, it's all about conflict, it's all about negotiations. Um, and so I say that strategy is the domain of business, war, and sports. And so there are these
Mhm.
fundamental underlying kind of principles, which are derived in part from game theory, which have applications in all of these domains. So before we kind of dig into your approach to this issue, maybe we can talk about, why is it that economists have, for the most part, sort of stopped short of talking about
Mhm.
the vast majority of the human experience, which has involved, right, these situations and these tools.
Yeah, so I think it's partly true, and I think it's partly not true. I mean, I think I'd say, The Strategy of Conflict by Thomas Schelling is actually one of the most important books written on conflict, and a lot of the important, I think, some of the theory that has contributed to our understanding of conflict was born in labor economics and law and economics as to why we actually avoid strikes or sometimes have strikes, why we have court battles and don't. And I think there was always a healthy interchange with political science. And then certainly political science carried it a lot forward. It's at the center of that discipline. And, and, and at the same time, it's true because in some sense, when war became central and when fighting and violence became central to what I worked on, I ended up drifting towards political science. And so I sort of think of myself as both. My first jobs were in political science departments, and I'm still sort of, I think, as much a political scientist as I am an economist. But I would say more and more, it's become more and more of a mainstream subject over the last 15, 20 years in economics, so that it's not just theoretical contributions being made by game theorists, but I think a lot of like a healthy amount of the empirical investigations and the pushing of the frontier in civil wars and gang wars and has been made by people who did their economics PhDs. And so but the nice thing, I'll say, it's very collaborative. I mean, I think both sides are actually both the other social scientists and economists are playing well together on this subject too.
Now, I think you're operating at a bunch of different levels. I mean, you talk about kind of interpersonal conflict, right? You talk about honor culture and,
Yeah.
the kind of violence that can arise in these very low level, person to person interactions. And then you work your way up to, gangs, and then you work your way up to, large political entities. Um, and you look
Hmm.
for commonalities kind of at all levels, and of course highlight differences. Um, it seems also very ambitious to think about kind of general rules that can apply both at the interpersonal level and at the large scale geopolitical level. And it seems like the commonalities there are most it's easy to draw commonalities, right, when you sort of anthropomorphize the kind of political institutions, right? So when we're talking about like, Saddam Hussein versus,
Hmm.
George Bush, it's kind of easy to say, oh yeah, that's kind of like, two people meeting in a dark alley. And in fact, a lot of the differences that we encounter are precisely arise because that's not the case, right? That these individual actors are operating in these very complicated social and political structures.
Right.
So, did you ever think of kind of doing two separate books, right? One for the kind of more gang
Right.
violence and sort of low level violence, another one for large geopolitical situations.
Well, I work. Well, I want to separate. Actually, I want to distinguish between interpersonal violence and then group violence. And then I think amongst groups, there's a difference between a village and a nation, right? And there's a difference between a gang of 30 people and and an army of 30,000. So I don't want to overstate the similarities, but I think individual interpersonal violence is really its own category, and I dwell on it a little bit in the book because some of the evidence and some of the insights we have comes from individuals, and individuals do run some of these groups and countries that go to war, so we need to understand them. Uh, but but I think actually once we just talk about groups, I think a group of 30, like a well organized group of 30, and a well organized village or well organized nation is actually these are not so distinct. There's a huge amount of difference in why they fight with one another, but we learn a lot, I think, about the commonalities. There's just some really basic strategic and psychological group level factors that I think are operating at all these levels. And and my personal work is really at this gang and village, and like that's my day job. I'm working at this more and rebel group level. Like I'm working at this more meso level of groups and a little bit at the individual level. But I wrote a book that was more integrative because everything I was learning just sort of made me realize that all of the lessons from international politics were really relevant and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so we focus on the differences. That's what we do as scholars. We spend all of our time focusing on the differences and specializing, as I did. So fine, let's do that. But let's do a little bit of integrative looking at
And I
commonalities.
think one of the main messages of your book is that, war and conflict is in many ways, or at least war and conflict that involves violence is kind of the exception rather than the rule. Um, and this to me, this was very eye-opening for me because it's really about perspective, right? I mean, we have a tendency to dwell on violence simply because it's something that we want to eliminate or reduce, right? In the same way that doctors
Of
focus on
course,
sickness, right? I mean, they look around and all they see are sick
yeah,
people because they want to intervene when they see sickness. But you're pointing out that for every incidence of violence, right, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of similar incidents that result in some kind of nonviolent resolution. Not to say that there's no conflict, not to say
right.
that there's no disagreement, but it doesn't turn into violence because violence has this very destructive consequences that cause the pie to shrink. And so if, in strategy, we always talk about, building the pie and then capturing your slice of the pie, but, no one really benefits when the pie
Yeah,
is dramatically shrunk. So why, I mean, so
exactly.
why do you suppose that, I mean, is it just simply that we overestimate violence because we're interested in trying to reduce it? Like, why is it that we fail to see how the kind of
Hmm.
the baseline condition is one where we peacefully resolve conflict?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we know. I don't know there isn't good research, so I can kind of speculate. Why is it that? So, for example, everyone has been paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, with good reason. 2 weeks into Russia's invasion, India accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan, and common ensued. And there's been a relative degree of peace between India and Pakistan over Kashmir for decades. That's only very occasionally, spiked into usually very brief violence. So that's the normal state of affairs. So why do we have to scroll through 17 pages of news on our New York Times app before we get to that? Um, I don't think it's the journalists because the New York Times, they were actually reporting it. Like all of these news agencies actually had the story, we just didn't read or retweet it or chat about it. And so I think there is this sort of tendency to focus on the violent for the right and the wrong reasons. The right reason is sort of like a doctor. You want doctors to focus on the terminally ill, but you don't want doctors to forget like the normal state of human health is health, and that people tend to get better, and that most illnesses are short, right? And so yeah, I don't know why we have that sort of blind spot, but what it means is the consequences. One, it means is we're often demoralized. We think that conflict and violence is a lot more common than it is, and so why, what can we do about it? But the other consequence is we get really rotten at diagnosis and treatment, right? So if you're essentially, if all you're doing is, it's like if I found super incredibly sick people and I tried to sort of list all the things that went wrong with them, I'd find like this laundry list of terrible things. But if I wanted to know what got them into this sickness in the first place, was it their lifestyle, was it some disease or some gene marker, I need to compare them to people who didn't get sick and find the differences, right? So we're only going to be good at diagnosis and then at designing treatments if we like actually pay attention to all the times people
Right. And I think you talk at the very local level where you talk about some of these later in the book, you talk about interventions. And I find it interesting that some of the interventions that have been effective are built on cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And I found this fascinating because I think you could probably also apply it to political leaders, right? I mean, the political leaders might be in need of a little bit of
Yeah.
of CBT, but you talk, you talk about this idea of the kind of civilized,
Well, just on that, actually, what's interesting is like it sort of goes back to this point about
yeah,
why focus on all these different levels. And the thing is that take something like, let's put aside CBT for just one moment, but take something like mediation, right? Mediation is designed to solve certain problems that often go wrong, and the reason it works and the reasons it's effective are often the same at the village level and the gang level and the country level and the international level, and these people who do exactly the same things to some degree, right? To some degree of abstraction. And then cognitive behavioral therapy is something we do for individuals to basically make them more rational and not make certain kinds of systematic mistakes. But we do similar types of things again at every level of society. We socialize ourselves and we try to socialize our leaders in order to have them not make the kinds of systematic, emotional, but also strategic mistakes that are so common. And so it's, I think that it's nice just because it's an example of like what you pointed out is just why would you pool all this stuff together? And again, it's like I think this is where we sort of we learn something from the
yeah. I mean, but
commonalities.
the idea that people can just sort of that the conflict can be avoided through conversation. Um, I think some economists would look at this and say, well, this is kind of crazy, right? I mean, this is cheap talk, right? But there's information that is
Hmm.
extracted, right, which is going to sort of more clearly define the bargaining space and help them to reach agreement. But there's more than that, right? It's not simply about expanding the
Hmm.
informational set and creating greater transparency, which of course is one of the things that you're trying to do here. But it's also about um, you know subtly weaving together the preferences. Could you talk more about because mediation happens in family dynamics, it happens in kind of litigation contexts, right?
Hmm.
Divorces and most lawsuits never actually make it to trial, right? They get settled, and so there's this skill associated with mediation. What exactly is it that a good mediator does?
Right. Well, I mean, we'll probably get there. We're talking. I mean, in some sense, in the book, I talk about the reason we fight is the reason we don't fight is because war is so costly, and the reason we do fight is because we ignore or overlook those costs. And there's a small number of ways we generally do that, and I talk about five in the book. And mediation is essentially a partial solution to at least two or three of those five. Um, there's a whole bunch of ways in which we tend to systematically misperceive a situation. There's a whole set of ways in which the situation is uncertain. We don't have information, as you've said, and then and then when we do want to craft a deal that's sort of stable over time, especially as our power on each side is shifting, we have to rely on that partner. We have to believe they're going to commit to it, and finding that deal, that thing that we can both commit to, is itself sometimes, it's not always obvious. Skilled mediators are actually really good at sort of finding those creative arrangements, right? That so it's they're in economists might think of that as sort of reducing some transaction costs around finding an actual stable deal. And but that's just sort of, we're getting maybe ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I think the general lesson is that everything that actually helps resolve conflict or keep us from not breaking out into violence, which we avoid most of the time, is something that basically helped us pay attention to the costs and not go down one of these paths that made us choose the costly, like, sort of worst option, which is to try to
Yeah, well,
target for bloodshed.
a lot of the situations you're describing would kind of fall into the descriptor, state of nature, right? There are no kind of
Hmm.
third party enforced contracts available for a lot of these folks, right? And commitment
Right.
problem, of course, and the problem of
Right.
time and consistency is one that you reference. Um, and so, I mean, that's an entire
Yeah.
domain, right? How do you come up with these self-enforcing deals? And is there, it goes beyond simply kind of better information, right, and more transparency, and it goes to, how do you create commitments? How do you get, maybe you could articulate, I mean, there's five different, you're right, I kind of raced through this. We probably should articulate all
Yeah.
five of these reasons why conflict emerges, and why the solutions that we've referenced so far don't apply to all of them. I mean, I think that, the first one with unchecked interest,
Yeah.
mediation is going to be less helpful in that situation. But maybe walk through the kind of what are the five reasons why people resort to violence rather than kind of working it out peacefully.
Sure. Yeah. So like I said, whatever every time we resort to violence, and what I think of as like prolonged fighting, it's it's because we've ignored the costs or willing to pay them, and that could be our societies or our leaders. And so the first of these instances is basically where the person who's deciding, or the group that's deciding whether or not to take the larger group to war, isn't accountable for most of those costs. So what economists or political scientists would think of as an agency problem. And so the extreme version is a personalized dictator, maybe not unlike Vladimir Putin, who, this means they not only will just discount a lot of the costs, but they may have their own private agendas that war pursues, like material private agendas, like, I am going to be able to expand my power base and stay in power longer if I fight this war. And so, and that's interesting how little economists and political scientists have talked about that as a cause of war and really explored it. It's probably the most fundamental and the most common.
Well, and it's weird there because,
The second
economists are
reason
always talking about the
we go
agency
to,
problem with respect to
yeah,
corporate behavior, right? They talk about how, in say
yeah,
leading up to the financial crisis, people would talk about how the leadership of the large investment banks would essentially be able to walk away with all the gains and not have to worry about, absorbing the losses. So it would seem like a natural application of a tool that economists have been, using in other domains.
and maybe it's so natural that people have sort of, I mean, for a theorist, it's trivial, right? Of course, if what I've just described is actually very simple. Now, it's not actually trivial. There's a couple of theory papers that sort of wind us through some of the interesting dynamics that happen. But a lot of the famous game theorists who wrote about war decided to focus their attention on a couple of the other ones we'll get to, because they're more strategically complex. It's not as intuitive. Whereas, what I just explained, I think, is just obvious to everybody once you explain it. That a dictator is probably more ready to take their people to conflict than a fully checked and balanced one. And so it may be the triviality that meant it was theoretically uninteresting, but then what's peculiar is just how, of those of us who do empirical research, how few people really focus on that, and whether they're writing history books or running regressions, have really failed to dwell on it. So that's the surprising thing, the fact that
But in a
it's
sense, I
well, we've
mean,
lost empirical
it's not
focus on it.
entirely obvious because you could argue that if a dictator has sort of a longer time horizon than say a politician with a
Yeah.
who's only there for a short period of time, then the shadow of the future is going to be much greater for that dictator or that dynast, and so one would think that you could make a case that
Yeah.
that individual is is if he benefits in the short run, but there's a large cost in the long run, then they're going to be more attuned to that, right?
Yeah. So that's fair. I mean, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of ways in which people try to rationalize dictatorial leadership, especially at early stages of development. My own view and some of the work I'm trying to do right now, which is testing this, is I think that kind of falls apart when you look at the historical record, which is that if we cherry pick the handful of Lee Kuan Yew's and sort of and decide that every dictator can be made in their image, then yes, the world looks very rosy. The Lee Kuan Yew's are very, very exceptional. Most of the autocrats who I think have had sustained success records in growing their societies or keeping them peaceful are extremely checked and balanced ones. Not all, because not all autocracies are personalized and centralized. And so some of the work I'm doing right now suggests that a lot of the great growth disasters, a lot of the conflicts, a lot of the episodes of political instability and misery happen not only within within autocracies, but mainly within the more personalized ones where power is essentially unchecked. But the other thing that we're vulnerable to, I mean, this sort of second category is the idea that actually a group might be willing to pay the cost of war because they get something that they can only get through fighting. In particular, a leader might get something, and if that leader's unchecked, then we might be vulnerable to their personal, whatever intangible incentives they want, or ideological goals. And so, again, to return to this example of Russia and Ukraine, this is the story everybody hears in the newspapers, that Putin is waging this war either out of a sense of personal glory or a sense of national glory and accomplishment, or making up for certain humiliations. That's basically a story that says the Russian people, or more specifically Putin and his cabal, are pursuing this ideological agenda. And the other story that you don't hear quite as often, but I think helps us understand this conflict, is the Ukrainians are fighting because they're pursuing an ideological agenda. They're fighting for liberty, and they're willing to pay the cost of fighting, and they didn't want to settle. They were offered a semi-sovereignty, and it was a pretty nasty deal, and they said no way. Which is not, and Americans, I think, are sympathetic to this because that's the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution was a tyrannical superpower offered semi-sovereignty, and Americans were weaker, probably should have taken that deal in some sense, but decided that they valued liberty too much. That's the noble story of the American Revolution. I think it's mostly true, and that too is just really saying, well, there's a price to pay, but we're willing to fight for this higher ideal. I think we exaggerate that a little bit, especially in this case with Russia versus Ukraine. But
Right. So I think in one situation, even if the parties had a perfect crystal ball and they could see what the ultimate outcome is. I mean, this is what we teach in kind of, law and economics, right? The litigants would, if they had perfect vision into, where the most likely outcome is, if they go to court, they'll just replicate that in a settlement and then save themselves all the cost of litigation. But then there's going to be some people that are either going to refuse to realistically acknowledge those probabilities, and that's one type of bias get in the way. And then there's others who are just simply unwilling to accept that for non-pragmatic reasons.
Right, and I think that's kind of what I'm trying to center attention on with this. I'm trying to say there's just no regrets. And yeah, you could tell me the settlement, we could look in a crystal ball, but the compromise that is necessary by our relative strength is simply repugnant to me. It's either repugnant to me because it's against some ideal I have of liberty, or that I deserve this, that this is unjust, I just want to cause you pain in order to avoid this settlement. Or it's going to be the case that there's something, I actually enjoy the act of fighting through and obtaining glory. The fact is, though, is that where I think it really matters is suppose I'm a leader on one of these sides, and I can manufacture an ideological intransigence, at least that's partial on my side. I can convince my people that certain compromises are repugnant or unjust or not in the interest of the nation. Yeah. Then what I can narrow the bargaining range, and I can narrow the bargaining range in my favor. right? So I think that's typically what's happening. It's not that glory is just driving us to war. I think it's that leaders are being
Yeah.
strategic and saying, let's manufacture an ideology that shuts off all of the unfavorable compromises. And let's hope that the other guy doesn't do the same thing so successfully
So
that
it's
we
like
both
tying your
shut
hands. I mean,
off
you
any
used Iran as
possibility
an
of
example,
compromise.
right? Where in negotiations, the Americans were afraid to,
Yeah,
you know, force them to their knees, so to speak, right? So if one party can convince the other
yeah,
that humiliation would be. I mean, we've seen that play out with the Putin story, where a lot of people have said, "Oh, well, whatever you do, you don't want Putin to lose face because he's going to be very dangerous in that scenario, right?" So, is that something that's easier to
yeah.
credibly communicate when you are a dictator, right, like Saddam Hussein, or is it something that's easier to communicate when you do have, right, some democratic accountability, right? I mean, having the because I mean the two things seem to be at work,
Yeah.
I mean, democratic accountability, people are going to suffer all the consequences of war, and so that's going to mitigate against war. But then, if you're democratically accountable, presumably the ruler could say, "Look, it's outside of my hands.
Yeah.
I need to, please the people who are, very upset."
Yeah, I think we're seeing both happen here, right? I think that a Ukrainian politician will find it very difficult to make some pragmatic compromises to find peace because it will be so unpopular. I think the war, but I think also some very successful propaganda has, and the information war is being won by the Ukrainians in many ways. And so I think they've constructed this partly as a bargaining tool. I think it's partly a natural reaction to what is an illegal and horrible invasion. And so I think it does tie the hands of a democratic leader in terms of what compromises they can make. Ultimately, I'm I'm somewhat optimistic about Zelensky's ability and inclinations to make compromises. He's been from the very beginning signaled this, and so I think he recognizes that their compromises are going to need to be made, and he may have the credibility to make them on his people, on behalf of his people. Yeah, whether or not it's easier for a dictator, I don't know. Yeah, who can play that? I think some are better at establishing that credibility than others. Um, and frankly, I think it's a big mystery about just whether or not Putin needs to save face or whether he's actually quite pragmatic about it. I actually lean towards him being a lot more pragmatic than most of what you hear in the newspapers. But I don't know him, never met him,
Well,
not
one
a
of the
Russian
reasons why I think
specialist. So what
you're
do I know?
interested in having a taxonomy of causes of conflict is that depending on the diagnosis, there are different remedies, right? So, in the first case where there's this
Right.
unchecked leader, right? Presumably the remedy would be some kind of targeted intervention if you're trying to kind of impose peace from without. And I'm thinking of like these Magnitsky
Yeah.
sanctions, right? So rather than just sort of imposing this
Hmm.
that's widespread across the whole country, how do you come up with sanctions that really precision target the folks who benefit from the conflict? And then presumably that would, make them think twice about the
Hmm.
conflict. What has do those and you talk about the problem with evaluating the efficacy of these sanctions because we don't have any real A/B tests on it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sanctions, so economic sanctions, international criminal courts, or just criminal courts in general for subnational conflict.
Like
Like, there's
Charles
lots of
Taylor, for
ways to
instance,
sort
I
of
think
use carrots and
he
sticks
was hauled before
to,
a court, right? And some of the folks in Srebrenica. Yeah.
yeah, actually, first they offered him a carrot. They were like, here's this sweet deal in Nigeria. We're going to let you, the way you get a lot of warlords out of their situation and get them to give up is often by promising them a nice retirement. Um, that's 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 no longer a credible promise because eventually a lot of these people, including Taylor, have gotten hauled in front of the like
Pinochet,
basically
I think.
not the International Criminal Court, but some kind of international tribunal. Yeah, some form of international tribunal, and so now we just that's probably an effective deterrent for certain kinds of behavior. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. But we don't know because there's a lot of dogs that don't bark, and so we don't know which dictators, which warlords have avoided something because of the fear of sanctions. We don't know, like, what 12 nasty things might Putin have done that he hasn't done because he feared sanctions earlier, or he fears
And
greater
I think one of the
sanctions.
examples you reference is the Colombian government going after the drug warlords, right? Where there it was a very, very selective stick, which was extradition to the United States, and that seemed to
Hmm.
be somewhat effective.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, it
well,
has been.
we never made it past the first the first one.
Two, yeah. So far, well, no, we talked about two. We talked about who might not bear the cost, and then we talked about leaders or
Uh,
people who are
right.
willing to pay the cost for some intangible or ideological goal. So we covered two. The other two others are what what game theorists like to talk about in terms of uncertainty and commitment problems, and I think there are these subtle strategic logics that people invented to understand why we don't strike, why we don't have court battles, why we don't have uh, legal battles most of the time, but why when they do occur, they occur, and that's not made it out into the public sphere. But they're kind of intuitive. Anyone who's ever played poker, for example, understands what's going on with uncertainty. It's the idea that you don't know what cards your opponent holds, and therefore you have to make a decision about whether to raise or to call or to fold. And under that uncertainty, you have to make some guesses, and your guesses might be wrong. So in some cases, war is a gamble. Now, because war is so costly, and neither one of you wants actually to, unlike poker, you're not trying to, you know, it's not like when you win a
Yeah.
game of poker, you also have to pay this enormous cost of like pain, right? There's no incentive to cooperate there, so that it's not a great analogy. Um, but even so, your opponent does have an incentive to try to tell you what their cards hold, but you're never really quite sure because they could be bluffing, right? And the optimal strategy when you're worried about a bluff is never to fold all the time and it's never to call all the time, right? It's actually what strategists and game theorists would call a mixed strategy. You're basically gonna sometimes call, sometimes fold, and so that risks a certain amount of war in order to basically because of this basic uncertain environment. Um, uncertainty also creates some dynamics of reputation that you might not just you might even if you think like, there's a whole bunch of other poker players watching you, seeing how you
Mhm.
play, and deciding what kind of player you are based on how you play, right? And that's going to carry over into your future. So if you can successfully bluff this one time, maybe you can actually successfully bluff in future. People leave you alone in future. You can build a reputation for toughness, and so that might be an incentive to actually fight war one time to sort of signal to everybody else just how tough you are. And so this is why
Mhm.
game theorists love to write these papers because there's all of these interesting strategic dynamics that arise from uncertainty, especially when you have like many observers, many interactions. And so it makes this actually quite complicated. We're very willing to say, oh, Putin made a mistake. He shouldn't have gone in. But that forgets how 5 months ago how uncertain some of these things were. We didn't know how strong and plucky the Ukrainian resistance would be. We didn't know how unified Western sanctions would be, and we
Mhm.
didn't know how strong and capable the Russian military would be. And the idea that Putin would get a bad draw on all three of these things was
Yeah.
always within the realm of possibility, but nobody predicted this. Least of all, evidently, Vladimir Putin. So we can call that like a mistake in retrospect. And in part it is, but I think it's
Well,
more of a
I think,
gamble and a miscalculation.
implicit in some of your discussion is what I think of as kind of a venture capital approach to warfare, which is that, it's not either or. It's not like, okay, all on
Hmm.
war versus peace, but rather a lot of the fighting is designed to
Right.
elicit information, right? To find out exactly what the bargaining power of
Yeah.
your opponent is, right? So, strategically selecting certain types of conflicts that will probe the enemy
Yeah.
to sort out exactly how strong they are, to figure out whether they're bluffing, right? Uh, could you talk a bit about that? And when, because
Yeah.
if you can find out, get that information at relatively low cost, then you can better decide whether it makes sense to fight or negotiate.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you hold parades with your weapons, but you hold missile tests. Which we see, right? This is what North Korea is constantly doing right now. You have border skirmishes. you probe your enemy, you see how they respond. There's a lot of this going on between India and China, for example, and within Kashmir. There's lots of ways in which in the book I also talk about gang banging and the ways that gangs in Chicago signal, both probe the toughness of like their adversaries and also signal their toughness, right? And so amidst all this uncertainty, you're constantly trying to like size the other side up, and the other side has an interest in.
Right. So
The other side has an interest in never being
to signal as much strength as you can, right?
They have an interest in, yeah. Exactly. You'd like to be overestimated.
It's like having all the fake soldiers
never wanna be
circulate on the
underestimated.
battlements, right? In different outfits to, project strength.
Yeah. Exactly. And maybe the reason but there are limits to that, right? There's a strong argument to say that. I think there was a piece recently written in a blog and online journal called War on the Rocks. A piece recently written that made, I think, a very persuasive argument that the initial invasion of Ukraine was run by the intelligence side, by the FSB, and not by the Ministry of Defense, and that they basically thought they gambled on this being basically a lightning strike kind of invasion, grab the capital. The way they did not settle in for a long invasion, they just basically put all their chips on see if we can grab the capital quickly and either kill the president or have him get on a plane, at which point Ukrainians will surrender, which I actually think was a possible outcome. It was a lot less plausible than I think they predicted it to be, and then they strangely didn't really have a plan B, which is the bizarre thing. But I think this was a gamble, given the uncertainty of just how plucky and resistant Ukrainians would be, that they'd actually be able to essentially exercise some kind of almost coup d'etat. And partly that was their bias and misperception, which is another one of the five, which we haven't gotten to. But I think
Right.
it was also just a part
And
of the
you
uncertainty.
you actually mentioned things like agonistic displays in there somewhere, right? Which is what the animals will do when they encounter one
Yeah.
another. They'll kind of size each other up and pretty much do anything they can to avoid having to fight, right? Through displays of strength.
Yeah.
And we see that, but that can get you trapped. I think you mentioned Saddam Hussein, right? Who was trying to communicate strength by leaving some uncertainty around the weapons of mass destruction, but then he got trapped because at that point
Yeah.
he couldn't
Right.
reveal his weakness.
Uncertainty is, to me, like, uncertainty is really important because if there's just two parties to the dispute, and then your incentives to reveal your hand are actually pretty strong. Like, at the end of the day, you really do, at the end of the day, you just don't want to go to war. And then if you start fighting, the incentives to stop fighting are very, very high when there's just you and one other disputant. But if you've got a whole bunch of other onlookers, then all of a sudden your willingness to sort of show your hand, especially if it's not a particularly strong hand, and your willingness to stop fighting erode somewhat, because if you have a shot at actually at pulling off the bluff, and once your bluff is called, fighting long enough to make it look like that bluff was credible all along, and basically gambling every time that the other side will concede, you only ever make that gamble because you think there's some payoff. And so the point I make in the book, which is a point made by a lot of historians and political scientists and journalists who observe this, is the United States wasn't even America's number one enemy. The United States was maybe number 4 or 5. Sorry. The United States wasn't Saddam Hussein's number one enemy. He was number 4 or 5. He was worried about Iran. He was worried about Israel. Most of all, he was worried about his own generals, and he was worried about people in his own country, the Shiites and the Kurds, who had risen up against him many times. And so he has all of these other people who place, in some sense, are a much more imminent threat to him than he believed the United States to be. And so he's playing this game with the United States with this dangerous audience looking onwards, and he's thinking everything, any misstep I make with the United States and these people, even if I avert this U.S. invasion, or even if they bomb my capital, and I don't think they're ever going to do more than that, at least I'll have convinced these other
Now, I
guys
think
how tough I am.
you talk about how humans are fundamentally cooperative. I interviewed Richard Wrangham, and he said, if you put 600 chimpanzees on a plane and flew them across the country, that rip each other to pieces. You put humans on there, and we safely make it to the other side. And you have a lot of examples of this tendency to try and resolve conflict. And one of my favorite examples that you talked about were the raisons, right? The patios in, the folks at the prisons in Medellin, and how they were able to
Yeah.
kind of broker peace among the different kind of gangs on the streets of Medellin. So if you're
Yeah.
kind of if you're in law enforcement, right? Uh, and your goal is to kind of keep the peace on the streets, then your goal should be to facilitate cooperation to some degree, right? Rather than to dispel it, right? And you see this with
Hmm.
prisons, right? Where they sort of have almost, the prisoners organize themselves into these hierarchies, and the guards will kind of let them be, right, and leave them alone and allow some kind of self governance and self management.
Yeah.
Um, do you, I mean, it seems, I think a lot of people would find that a bit
Yeah.
counterintuitive. They would think, oh, you have to crack down on criminals. You have to arrest them under all circumstances. Maybe, keep them apart. Don't let them talk to each other. Um,
Right.
but you describe a very different situation. Could you dig into that, and how how did you do work on that? Because you go into
Yeah.
some very difficult places and have some difficult conversations. That one sounded particularly interesting.
Yeah. So, like living in anarchy is terrible because there's this uncertainty, and now the only way you maintain your security is not the only, but one of the ways you maintain your security amidst all this uncertainty about how resolved you are is by basically building a violent reputation. It's far nicer, right? And that's how many societies operate, not just in prison or in gangs, but in, I don't know, a lot ancient herder societies, a lot of modern societies where the state is somewhat absent. They create these cultures of honor and other sort of blood feud systems that
Yeah, I
essentially
found it, one of your
create
one of
what
your
some
one of the most
anthropologists call
interesting
the
fun
peace of the
facts
few,
in the
which is
book was
the
that the further you were from a Mountie station in Canada, the more prone you were to interpersonal
yeah,
violence. And it wasn't just simply that you were afraid of being arrested. It was just that your
exactly,
propensity towards poor anger management, let's call it, was greater.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. So the idea that, or the idea that, like, well, it's also reputational. I mean, like, in a we talked about these, you might pursue intangible incentives like glory and honor. You also have a reputational incentive to construct, like, so glory and honor might just actually, and codes of honor might be sort of social norms that have evolved because it's strategically optimal in a situation of anarchy. And so amidst uncertainty, humans have developed all sorts of customs that then look like these intangible incentives, but are actually sort of like social evolutionarily, like, optimal responses to the absence of a state. Okay, so in this anarchic environment, whether for calculated reasons or just instinctually, we've been socialized to sort of construct violent reputations. But everybody in that situation likes to have the Mounties to some extent, right? Because if you have the Mounties come in and provide order for 100 years, then you don't have to you don't need peace in the feud. You just have peace because there's this sort of benevolent overlord. And so this is, to some extent, what emerges in a lot of prisons. And it happens in the United States, it happens here in Illinois and California and Texas, large prison systems where you're at risk of personal violence a great deal of the time, and it happens in Medellin, Colombia, which is a place I work. And so what you see is like the emergence of order, because everybody likes to have their social relationships structured in such a way that avoids this really terrible thing, which is violence. And so criminals are willing to give power to other criminals who are able to provide them governance. And then states sometimes realize, not all of them, the United States, we tend to figure we don't need this, and so they do their best to exterminate it. But other places have decided, you know what, like that kind of order, we'll take that because it just means there's less violence as a result. And so we'll make, we'll make implicit like quid pro quos, or sometimes we'll make explicit deals with these criminal organizations that you keep the peace over there and we'll leave you alone. And so it's a really
another
common
country you've done
solution
work
to
in
this,
is
like,
Liberia,
anarchy.
right? And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that work, right? Because there's a society that really broke down into a lot of ethnic violence, and has been sort of precariously peaceful for the last decade or more. And I was wondering, what are some of the things that are necessary in order to kind of keep the peace, right, institutionally?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I see, Liberia, like any country, there's lots of social cleavages. There were many ethnic groups and religions, but there were also a big diversion between the elite and the rest, and the elite being of people who were more associated with American colonizers, although these were Black American colonizers. Liberia was founded by free blacks moving in a back to Africa movement, and being self-governing for the last roughly 170 years plus, and so a relationship of elite non-elite inequality. So, but really, it was a hyper-centralized place with an unchecked leader, and that meant that leader was unwilling to. That creates a few problems. One is it's like as soon as power is super centralized, it's attractive to seize, and it's seizable, right? You can't really affect a coup d'état in the United States because there's no single center of power to seize. But in a lot of highly personalized dictatorships, like Liberia was at the time, power is very, very seizable. And then these unchecked leaders, both the one who wants to seize that power and the one who holds that unchecked power, have fewer disincentives for war because of these unchecked interests that we've just talked about. And so I went there after the war. I was invited there by a past president and a political scientist who's a mentor of mine. This is his thesis. I mean, this is really who I learned this from. That over-centralized power was the most fundamental problem that led to the war. And then things broke down occasionally along ethnic or religious lines because there has to break down along some social cleavage. And that was the social cleavage that had happened.
Well, I mean, if you look at the emergence of the European states, right, and the decentralization of power and the creation of checks and balances, I mean, this process happened over a long period of time. It seems like to the extent that we have sort of foreign policy, foreign aid that is attempting to kind of help these countries, the idea of creating these checks and balances doesn't seem to be high on the priority list, right? Is there why is that? Is it just that the
No.
development establishment finds it easier to deal with centralized authorities? You have one institution that you can kind of funnel the money through and so forth. Like why is it, or is it just that we failed to acknowledge the importance of checks and balances in the political system?
I mean, I think both. I mean, it's funny because checks and balances are so fundamental to the American system of government. It's so fundamental to many Western governments. But I think we fail to recognize just how stabilizing a force that is in the long run, because in the short run, it's super inefficient. Right? For America, we're sort of mired in inability to get anything done because of these checks and balances. But that's sort of a feature, not a bug, and it actually was designed that way. So if you're a rich nation dealing with a poor nation, there is a certain convenience to dealing with a dictator because they can get things done. There can be these great leaps forward. Unfortunately, for every great leap forward, there's one and sometimes two great leaps back, and we do seem to have a certain blindness to this. There's an allure to the strong man, and this harkens back to some of that work I was telling you, like there's a sort of romanticization of Lee Kuan Yew. There's a certain selection. We kind of remember the successes and we overlook the failures. What we actually overlook is the fact that most of the great successes turn into failures, right? That these people bring their country up and they bring their country down. Mostly as they cling on to power rather than trying to institutionalize what they've built. And maybe just the short-term focus of a lot of, it's funny, you work with the US government and they at the one time they like to get things done with these strongmen, and then they're just so frustrated by the corruption and the ways in which things get misused.
Well, is there a way to help build up sort of the counterbalances? Because I mean, it doesn't seem like a winning strategy to sort of say to a leader, okay, we're only going to deal with you if you give away all your power, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's gonna work. Are there ways that you can?
Right. A lot of international development and a lot of international political assistance is actually trying to decentralize power in a really, I think, productive way. Like any time that you're trying to, and it's all meddling, right? But I think it's a lot of it's well-intentioned meddling. Anytime you're trying to economically empower the masses or raise mass literacy, I think you're inherently decentralizing power. You're improving the mobilizational and the material power of the non-elites versus the elites. And that seems like there are very few downsides to that. Anytime that an activist group or an outside party tries to help political parties organize greater, to have there be freer and more transparent elections, to help foster institutions of election monitoring. There are lots of things that on the margin, I think, act to check the power of these centralized elites. Now, there's lots of outside meddling that accentuates the power of elites. The fact that international institutions can only land and treat with sovereigns, for example, and they can't make a deal with the mayor, and they can't make a deal with the state governor, for example. That concentrates a lot of power in these societies. But really, it's not just like the outside meddlers. Like, I mean, there's a lot of inside, anyone who wants to reform their own society, any Nigerian or Liberian or Iraqi or Russian or American or whomever wants to sort of reform their own society because they think it's too centralized and corrupt and problematic, I think also does well to sort of think about how you decentralize power and basically give more material or mobilizational might to the non-elites. And a lot of what we do is really successful at that. And I would argue that that's been not just better for policy.
And one of the things you also talk about is how you build
but
up
it's better
these
for
kind of
political stability.
interdependence relationships and cross-cutting identities. And this seems very attractive, very appealing, of course, but it seems very fragile, right? When we look at what happened in, say, Bosnia, right, where you had these people that were neighbors and they were, I mean, interacting for centuries, and then all of a sudden this conflict happens, and then they sort themselves, very quickly into these camps that are defined by identities that they may not have even possessed at any point in time. So how do you try to? I mean, you had some wonderful examples some empirical examples of when during the football games, right, in Africa, right, where the Cameroonian team, has a victory, that inter-country violence goes down, after these matches. How can you build these identities that go across the prior ethnic lines or other kind of divisions in the society?
Yeah. So with the Balkan example, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is that there's no magic solution to intergroup tensions. That there are examples of neighbor killing neighbor, and lots of sorting. I think we have to be careful. It's sort of like not focusing on the wars that happen and paying attention to the wars that do. We have to focus on, I think, all of the cases. And I think on average, a lot of the evidence shows that intermingling and being intertwined economically and intertwined socially is protective. And it's protective because it gives you a stake in the other side's well-being. And to go to war with them would cause even more harm, would shrink the pie even further because you're intermingled. And so it's almost like you care about their costs, right? Because the costs of war that keep us from fighting are really just our own costs. We don't care about the other side's costs. If you do care about the other side's costs, then it's inherently going to be protective. But it's like speed bumps on your street. You still might get a speeder, right? It's not a surefire solution, and so you're going to get Balkans, I think, just like you get speeders. And then as for how you construct these things, I mean, that is,
I
in
love
the
the
book I
example
talk about
from
long-term,
Mali.
short-term solutions.
The example you used from Mali and how
I think
that
making
worked
really
in
meaningful progress. Yeah. Yeah, there's, I mean, the ancient Malian example of an emperor who actually decides to sort of create like a social linkage based on surnames across basically similar surnames that have, if I'm a Taylor in this language and my last name is Taylor in this other language, like we're gonna and we're gonna sort of be cousins, and they create this tradition called cousinage. And so the myth, which is probably partly true, is that this was a deliberate construction to create sort of these cross linkages, so that any time when I went to this other ethnic group and I interacted with them, I would always have this sort of natural social relationship and set of expectations that I would always be connected to somebody, and that the places where cousinage is more common in Mali have been more peaceful. Nations try to construct national identities to reduce intergroup conflict within their country. And so your example of national sports teams and other ways of creating national identity, this might actually this might actually create tensions with other nations, but the idea is that it's actually...
Yeah, I mean, you see it for local teams, right? For instance, when immigrants come to European countries or to America, right? If, one of the ways that they can help integrate themselves is to, start following a football team or basketball team, and then those crowds of supporters, the ethnic differences seem to kind of disappear, or blend away, at least in those moments when the sports teams are playing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and Amos Sawyer, this Liberian former president and political scientist who I was mentioning, went back after the war, and he had some ideas. He wanted to create symbols of national identity that were shared. So he thought it was really problematic that like the national coat of arms for Liberia was a ship, sort of saying that the love of liberty brought us here. Right? That symbol is very powerful if you're an Americo-Liberian, if you're descended from one of the freed blacks that migrated in this Back to Africa movement 170 years ago. It's profoundly alienating to everyone else in the population for this to be the national symbol. And so there's this whole series of things that he wanted to do to construct national symbols and construct national identity that would unify rather than amplify these social cleavages, and basically to sort of erode social cleavages. And so I think there's a lot that can be done. I think there's on the margin, right? But of course, this is a long-term project, and some leaders will come to power, particularly unchecked leaders, who will have an incentive.
Now, I think you end the book with
a
whole section on what it means to be a piecemeal engineer, and this, I think this discussion could be applied to a whole bunch of different areas of economics and political science, right? I mean, you kind of build on Popper and Jane Jacobs and Hume and a whole bunch of other folks, but you emphasize this idea of humility, right? And I think you're pointing out that there's an under provision of humility in the kind of, I guess, foreign policy space, or in the peacemaking space, or even in the kind of intervention space, when you're dealing with crime, when you're dealing with gangs, when you're dealing with conflict of all sorts, and you advocate sort of a more experimental approach. So, I mean, I think this idea of design thinking has taken over in the business world. What are the impediments to it taking over in the policy world?
Mm-hmm. So I wrote that a lot of books like this die in the last chapter. They either provide some grand optimistic vision of peace or human progress in a 10-step. Now we have the answers. Here's the 10 things you can do to create peace, or they're just deeply pessimistic and that we're done for. We're all going to die. And neither one of those things is actually true. There's no 10-step plan for peace. I think there is a pretty simple set of ideas that that can help us diagnose better. But then it's like being a doctor. We don't exactly know exactly what the treatment's going to be. And we also, in each case, we just don't, we'll have to figure, we have the tools for diagnosis, but now the actual process of diagnosis is really complicated. And so if I, when you go, if you went to your doctor and you started to describe your symptoms and he interrupted you and said, what you need is, radiotherapy and radiation therapy and Tylenol, you would say, this sounds crazy to me. Like, you haven't even really heard about my problems. We haven't tried anything. Like, you haven't tried to sort of narrow down all the possibilities and then test out one by one with different treatments to sort of see what's responding, right? Which is, if our doctor did that, we would naturally recognize that this was we would never go back to that doctor. We would look for a doctor who's sort of taking this sort of careful, marginal trial and error approach and has a degree of humility. When we are asking our leaders to solve problems of development or change our cities or solve racism or solve conflict, which is much more complex, we have this totally different set of expectations. We kind of want them to come to us and promise us that Tylenol and radiation therapy are the answer, and all we need is more of them, and all situations are alike. And Tylenol radiation therapy worked for that country or this city or that people, so it must work for us. And I don't know why we have why we sort of why we accept that and why we're like that in these two different spheres of life. And I think we just have this amazing ability to forget how hard and complex a problem is a lot of social change. And so part of the book is just trying to say, let's take all these principles that we know that are commonsensical and we know are true in all these other domains, and let's realize how they're true in solving conflict.
I have to ask one last question, because you cited Bill Buford, right, in his famous book Among the Thugs, and I read that a long time ago, and I think it brings up something that makes us a bit uncomfortable, which is that for many people the violence and war really is exhilarating, right? It makes them kind of feel alive, right? And countless testimonies from soldiers and warriors throughout human history, um, and of course, net it's probably there's far more people that have miserable experiences in warfare, and you even talk about the fighter pilots and how the vast
Yeah.
majority of them died, but they still kept attracting new fighter pilots because of the pursuit of glory and status. Do you think that that's a fundamental human obstacle to peace? I mean, is that or is that something that's
hmm
kind of easy to divert into other channels?
So I think that it's I think that we are I think that we can be motivated to hate an enemy or take glory in a cause. So it goes a little bit back to these intangible incentives that we do possess these to some degree, and our leaders can manipulate us to hold them, and they can manipulate us to hold them for their own purposes and as well as for bargaining strength. That this idea that I can convince my population to be intransigent or glory seeking or loathe the other side, then it's going to shut off all sorts of bargains, and that's going to put us in a better place. And so fundamentally, this is a can be an impediment to cooperation. But I think what you point out is that the actual experience of violence is often so different that we don't need to experience very much of it to sort of have some of these illusions dispelled. Now, that sadly, that might mean we need several months of violence, but typically we don't need several years. In many societies and situations, we maybe need a single day. So that's perhaps the good news. And then the other piece of good news is sort of what you alluded to later, is that I think often these powers are used for good and not evil. And so they're the same tools we use to construct successful societies and ideas of not just national unity, but international human rights. And so on balance, I think these things have been used to be pacifying. But yes, we can fool ourselves, but more importantly, we can be fooled by unchecked, over centralized leaders into pursuing their interests against our own far too often. And I would say so to me, the be much less vulnerable in a more checked and balanced political system is my
Well, Chris, I think this is a
hypothesis,
very
but
timely book, and
to be
it's a great
to
work
be
of
determined.
history. political science, economics, conflict studies, all of that. And I think, it might give rise to a whole new subspecialization within the field of economics. Maybe we can have a weekly workshop or seminar on conflict and war and violence. Why we fight. Check it out. Roots of War and the Path to Peace. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining me.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.